this is it. And we tend to get people that perhaps, you know, wanted to come, couldn't make it, so quickly a bit. So in a second, I will introduce our panelists. Alice, I think you might need to give me screen share permission as well. Sorry, because I made you host, and now I can't share my screen. So yeah, before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our conference that's happening in March in New York, and I'll share my screen in a second to tell you a bit more about some of it. So we've got a full day of, now I've messed up. This is like how you can see how many terrible tabs I have open when I share my screen. So we have a full day of talks, we have a full day of workshops, and we have some really good speakers lined up. Jen, who's on this call, is one of them. Why can I not share my screen? Am I sharing my screen?
Yeah. Okay, you share.
So you're seeing all the terrible things all over my desktop. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
That's what I wanted. So yeah, we've got a day of workshops, we've got a day of talks, and we've got a panel event. And we've got some brilliant speakers lined up. So we've got Jen, who's on this call, is running a workshop with Sarah, which is going to be awesome. We've also got another workshop from Jen Schaefer from Netflix. And then we've got lots of talks. I think we've got about 12 talks lined up for the day as well. So it's going to be a really good event. So we are running it in real life and virtually. So you can grab a ticket from leadwithtempo.com/conference. And you can see also the full lineup of speakers and all the kinds of topics we'll be covering. But one of the topics that's we're going to cover tonight, and probably at the conference too, is taking care of yourself while taking care of a team, which is a topic like quite close to everybody's hearts in this year, because we've been through a lot of change. Lots of teams have been through a lot of change and are going through lots of changes. The kind of environment we're in, you know, people have been going through layoffs, and I mean, where I work, some of the team have been going through, you know, war. So it's just been a year. So we thought this would be a nice way to end the year covering this topic and talking to our panelists and getting some advice and tips from them. So I am really pleased to introduce them, and in no particular order, we've got Heldiney. So Heldiney is at Monzo, and actually Heldiney spoke at Content by Design, I believe, a couple of years ago when I was running that conference at Clear Left, and his talk went down really well. And I deliberately asked him to speak because he'd been through the process of starting working with content designers for the first time as a product designer, and it had been really game-changing for him. And so I was like, okay, cool, right, we need to really hear from a product designer on how to work with content designers from his point of view and what worked and what didn't work. And it was, yeah, it went down really well. And at the time, I think you were at Zoopla, Heldiney, and you're now at Monzo. So do you want to tell us a bit about what you're doing now, and yeah, how that's going?
Sure. Yeah, so I've been at Monzo for a year and 4 months. And in my time at Monzo, I've worked on everything that involves payments between people. So at Monzo, there are a range of features. I know not everyone is based in the UK. Monzo's a UK digital only bank. So I think we are one of 2 UK banks that don't have a bank branch at all. It's us and Starlink. There are other payment products in the UK, but we're the 2 only ones with banking licenses, so we can give out loans, and people can open up joint accounts, etc. And the experience so far has really taught me a great deal about all of the various ways in which you need to design for safety when you're creating experiences that connect people, even though it's payments. For example, early this year, we saw that people were using Monzo to send abusive messages to other people on Monzo. So if you broke up with someone and they became really angry and you blocked them on all other platforms, they would suddenly start using Monzo to send you abusive messages, because our payment network means that there's theoretically no character limit as to how long a message you can send to someone. It's not the traditional banking payment networks, which are called faster payment services. They have a much tighter character limit. So one of the bits of work I did this year is to allow people to like block each other on Monzo, which is a fascinating thing to work on, like blocking someone in your bank. But but these are sort of, you know, interesting paradigms that I've enjoyed working in quite a lot.
Yeah, that is super interesting, and not obviously what the first thing you would think of when you think of banking. But yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you. Are you enjoying it at Monzo? Because obviously, like, you've gone from property to banking, which is very different. But yeah, how are you? I guess you're enjoying it.
Yeah, you say that, but I think part of the reason I am at Monzo is the research that I used to do at Zoopla. So in our research, more often than anything, what used to come up was people struggled to save for a deposit, and they didn't know how to sort of budget properly. It was hard to understand how to juggle that amount of money being saved with everything else they need to spend in their lives. And I thought, oh well, you know, I could make a huge difference if I can help people with their money.
Yeah.
And also, it's something that I really care about. I was raised by a mother, only child, working class background, so all the pieces connect.
And you're also director of Samaritans.
Yes.
Just for a, side hustle.
Yeah, all of these, I think all these things are generally related. So Monzo's mission is to make money work for everyone. And I think the journey of how I became a director at Samaritans is linked with how I became a volunteer. So when I don't want to take up all the time, by the way. It's do I have, okay, cool.
It's interesting.
So when my girlfriend and we had a period where we broke up for a year, or more specifically, she broke up with me. And the reason why was we were living with my mum at the time, and my mum is very protective of her only son. So it was a terrible idea. And but it meant that I was feeling super low on, I don't know, I think several months into being split apart. We moved out into different houses, and I decided to call Samaritans. I wasn't feeling suicidal, but I felt that how sad I was feeling, if I allowed myself to keep feeling that way, I would start to lose some of the sort of meaning of what made me feel happy to be alive. And I called Samaritans, and because I sort of Googled it and I'd heard about the service before, and I remember the volunteer picking up. I remember there being quite a bit of silence after he introduced himself. And it was a very strange conversation because for the first time, you're speaking to someone whose sole purpose is to just listen to you. They have no agenda, so they can't give you any advice. And they literally cannot give you any advice, even if they wanted to. And part of the reason is, I'll share a bit more context later on. But it meant that there was all of this empty space to be filled, and I ended up talking and talking, and I would ask the volunteer questions, and the volunteer would point the questions right back at me. And I ended up saying, well, I spent so much time of my life setting objectives, thinking that I'm going to be with this person for the rest of my life. And I'm someone who's very goal oriented. And I feel that if I failed at this goal, that's really important to me. What's to say I can achieve any of the other goals that are important to me? And that was sort of hurting my confidence. And the volunteer said, do you think you're being fair on yourself to set goals that are dependent on the choices and actions of other people? And it completely shifted my way of thinking about goals. And I thought, okay, that's whatever this person did, I want to learn how to do that. So I signed up to do the training. I became a volunteer. I volunteered for 4 years. I then got asked to be a mentoring deputy director to help build out the mentoring team. When you become a volunteer Samaritan, you go through training, you go through mentoring, and then you can be on the phones on your own. And that's to make sure that people are supported all the way through, to make sure that the quality of the conversations remains high, and that everyone that calls is receiving adequate support. And after doing the mentoring deputy director role, I got vaulted to be the director. How it works is like you can't run for being a director, or you can't apply for it. It's just people sort of get asked, who do you think should be the next director? And the list of people that gets put together as a result of that get to decide whether they accept or decline. And because one of my aspirations is to be the CEO of a company at some point, I thought this is going to be good experience. It's a branch of 100 people. There's there are a lot of operational things to think about, a lot of policy things to think about, and thus I decided to take it on.
It's amazing. Really amazing and very admirable as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about that as we go through the conversation this evening, or this morning, wherever you might be in the world. So next up we have Nicole Alexandra, who joins us from Spotify. You might recognize Nicole from her podcast, which I guess has been going for quite a while now, Nicole. Quite a few years, I guess.
Yeah, I started it, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic. So it must have been like early 2020, mostly because I was frustrated because I teach content design and UX writing and content marketing, and they all pay so badly. Like teaching is such a frustrating thing to do. I don't know if it's like a global thing or if it's just specifically bad in Sweden. And I got so frustrated with them that I decided I'm just going to give all that content away for free. And that's kind of how the podcast came to be. And then I just kept going. It's been really fun because I get to talk to a lot of great people. Larry and I have also talked. Shout out to you, Larry. And yeah, right now it's a little bit on an unofficial hiatus just because it's very difficult to record stuff with a baby. But there is a lot of episodes scheduled and they will be coming again soon. So yeah, it's Content Rookie, by the way, that's what it's called.
And you mentioned that it's like, kind of, you've been frustrated by content people and content marketing backgrounds who may be like trying to kind of move into content design. Was that your background? How did you kind of get into content design?
Yeah, I actually talked about that in an episode recently. It's very difficult for me to define it because my original background way back is engineering. I'm the eldest of 4 sisters and my dad is a professor in physics. It was very important to him that I do something useful, which was physics or engineering. Nothing else was allowed, even though I always hated it. But so I actually started studying material engineering, which is not fun. I got really depressed. I developed a very serious eating disorder within the first couple of semesters and had to leave school and get that taken care of, which honestly, looking back, I'm not going to say that it's good that it happened because no, it was awful, but it did teach me a very valuable lesson, even though I was still very young back then, like 20 or 21. But it did teach me that I have to kind of stick with my own guns and do what I want to do. I ended up switching to business school where I majored in strategic marketing and copywriting. Really enjoyed that, and then kind of kept going there. Content design wasn't really a thing. I mean, I'm not super old, but I think I graduated like 2008, 2009. So it wasn't really something you could study. So I kind of came from the marketing angle, I guess. And what really manifested my career was that once I moved to Sweden, I moved here when I started studying my master's. I started working with a bunch of startups, freelancing and doing contract work. And that was a lot of copywriting from the start because, well, I do speak Swedish now, but I am bilingual in English and German, and a lot of Swedish companies need both of those languages. So I started doing a lot of copywriting and became increasingly more digital since Sweden has a lot of very techie startups. And then after a while, I suddenly started seeing, what is this term UX writing or what is this term content design that kept popping up on my LinkedIn and wherever. I was like, what are these people doing? And why do they get paid like 4 times what I am paid as a copywriter or content marketer? And then I read into that and realized that's what I'm doing. I got a little bit annoyed. And then I just essentially like changed my title and adjusted my portfolio a little bit to, show the UX challenge and things. And that's kind of how I became a UX writer, content designer. Like I did not do a course. I did end up reading all the like top books, but after the fact that I had already kind of been working with it. So I'm not sure if that's like an unconventional way of getting into it, because I feel like a lot of people have a similar story where they're kind of just like sidelined into it. But yeah, maybe good to share, because I think Now we do have a little bit of an issue with gatekeeping in the field. And I get so many messages from people who are very insecure. They're like, okay, which courses do I have to do? And like, what should I pay for? And which certificate do I need? And I'm always I push back a lot on that and try to be very open with, I didn't do any of that. And I've worked with the biggest companies and that's been fine. And I'm not saying that you can still get these kind of jobs. Maybe now the field is different and there's more people, but I do encourage people to not get too worried about not having the right skills, because I'm sure most of them have. Yeah, sorry for kind of going very into that.
No, I completely agree, because I've sort of from a similar background. Well, marketing and branding actually originally, but yeah, I completely agree on the whole sort of training side. So yeah, I'm with you on that. Kelly is our third panelist, and I guess, Kelly, you've probably got one of the biggest content design teams in Europe at booking.com. Am I right in thinking you've started with like one or two of you and you've grown to about 70? That's insane.
I checked today, it's actually 76. We do keep growing. And my story is also, I think, sort of similar to Nicole's. I think, like many of you, it was very unconventional. My background is actually in museum education and art restoration. So I have a degree in book restoration and photo restoration. And that's what I used to do in Italy. It got really hard when everything went digital. So the need for people who actually do the actual craftsmanship kind of reduced. And I went to the Netherlands, did a master's in publishing studies and digital media technology, took a little job at Booking. In the meantime, we were two writers. I was like, this will just be short term while I figure out what I'm going to do with my life. And I'm still there. So yeah, we were like two writers supporting a tech department of 75, I think, at the time. I don't even know how many we are now. Yeah, as far as how big our department is. I was the first team lead. So I think early on we had a centralized team. We started to embed writers into product teams. Management didn't really work well like that. So everybody was reporting to me. Then I moved into a principal role. There was a time where I could say I'd worked on every product we had. As a principal for about 6 years. About 2 years ago, Booking decided that maybe we could do better with craft management. So I moved into the director role, and we decided to put in place a team of you have to be the same craft to manage that craft. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've been doing for the last year, setting up that organization.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work you've done there.
But it's a lot of fun work, because I mean, in our case, when you don't report into your own craft, you can kind of get capped when it comes to your career growth. And I think this change for us opened up a lot of growth opportunities for everyone. And there's been so many talented people that we've finally been able to move into the right roles. So it's been really, I have to say, like, I hear a lot of people stress this year, but I feel like for us, it's been kind of a good year as far as like unlocking the potential of our people.
That's really nice. It's nice to hear some, positive stories as well, and how, the teams are thriving, because I think, like, all too often we do hear about the like tough times, and it's nice to hear that, there's teams that are able to help people thrive and get to those roles that they should be in. Actually, and that's probably let's kick off the topic, because I wanted to sort of start with that actually. And some of our teams are going through tough times, and I guess that feeling it can be hard to take care of a team. Sometimes, I've got a team of sort of 30, 34, 35, and it can feel quite hard to sort of take care of them. You can feel a bit kind of parental sometimes, where you're trying to keep an eye on everyone and make sure they're all happy, but going through change and tough times makes it even harder. And I just wondered, are any of your teams kind of going through a really tough time right now? And you're feeling that? How's yours going? Because I mean, I know, like, with Monzo, well, London sort of tech is going through that, well, probably what we're going through in a wider tech. Are any of the kind of ripples being felt in your organization?
Yeah, I think in terms of the actual layoffs. We're not experiencing them on our side. We did experience it in 2020. So I think since we made some very deliberate commercial decisions to try as hard as possible to not find ourselves in that place, and it's worked. So yeah, generally speaking, financially, that anxiety that doesn't exist here. But what we are seeing, and I've been doing some research internally over the past few months to speak to people and understand how they're feeling. It was sort of independent research with a few other people who volunteered in the team, like other senior researchers and me. And there are general sentiments of sort of anxiety, of feeling people need to perform above and beyond in order to justify their worth, which it's a sort of bottomless pit of how much energy you can pour into it, because people are working with a level of deep insecurity about whether they're good enough, whether they belong here, or whether their work is as good as other people's. There's constant comparison. Whenever someone shares good work that people find impressive, they suddenly start to compare themselves to that person. And you'd think, oh, it's probably a few folks that feel they're not performing as well that are feeling that way. But no, it's even top performers have this sentiment of being concerned whether they're doing enough or whether they belong here. And I think the layoffs that happen in the sector exacerbate that feeling, particularly as people think, oh, there's all this talent that's suddenly heading into the market. And I don't know if everyone thinks that consciously, but I know I become aware of that. There are all these people that are now available for work, etc. Like, how do you know if you're as good or better than some of these folks at what you do? And I think people find themselves asking those questions, and people find themselves being worried that a standard is being set by Elon Musk to what's expected in the rest of the industry, and people worry that that will happen in their companies eventually as well, so on and so forth. So yeah, I think the general climate, even if it doesn't directly affect companies, it affects the mindset and the headspace that people are in.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there's that kind of well, what if our CEOs are looking at that and as a model behavior, this is how CEOs should be like running their companies, is that going to trickle down and start having an impact? I saw someone said somewhere like one of the questions to ask at your next interview is ask the interviewer what they think of Elon Musk. And the answer might be quite telling. Are you seeing, Nicole, at Spotify, are you seeing any of the sort of fallout of what's happening in tech right now? It's an effect.
I mean, full disclosure, I am on maternity leave, so I'm kind of lurking, but unfortunately that is enough. So yeah, I was out, like, I don't know how much of this is confidential. I mean, Spotify has been very persistent with the fact that they don't want to do layoffs. They follow the Swedish employment model, which is generally one of the most prudent in the world, which means that the compensation is a little bit lower and there's a lot of job security, and they're trying to cut costs in other places, which they've started slowly rolling out. And it's interesting to see how differently people handle it. Like, some people just panic straight out. Some people, they get a little bit upset about it. Then there's people who run in the opposite direction. They're like, okay, like, now we really need to ship faster and make sure that the stock price doesn't drop more. And it's been, for me, I've had varying reactions over the past couple of months, I would say. I think when the whole Twitter thing started, I had a week or so where I was extremely anxious and very, very worried. And I was sure I was going to get laid off at Spotify as well. And because, content design, that's the first thing I'm going to cut, for them, probably not connected to any profits. I also work in the central team that is actually trying to centralize content design and UX writing. And so it's not directly connected to any of the big business bets. So I was just very anxious about that, very worried. But then I think what always happens, when you go through the grieving cycle, I kind of went into, well, there's nothing I can do about it. If they let me go, they let me go. And it's going to be cool because it's fine. There'll always be work. And so I kind of tried to personally at least, not worry too much about it, which is still difficult to do. And I think when it comes to my team, I have a new team. They're a very specialized team. So I work under Jen Smilch. I don't know if you know her. She used to be at Intuit. She's great. And we're essentially, like I said, centralizing UX writing and language modeling systems. So we have me as a content designer, then we have 2 ontologists and Jen. It's a very small team and a very specific team. And we're quite close. So we're a little bit like trying to hang out more and trying to just talk about it. And like, we'll check in on Slack and ask how people are feeling. If there's like, for example, a new post about cost cutting or whatever. And that's been really helpful to kind of make sure people have the option to speak up and discuss their fears. But it just feels like there's so little we can do, right? Like most of us, I assume, I don't know how it is for you, Kelly, but I assume maybe even for you, you're so far removed from the top decision makers that would decide a layoff. Like I found myself when I started first panicking, reaching out to my manager, like very directly, like, do you think there's going to be layoffs? Like I'm panicking. And she was like, well, I can't tell you any more than you know. Like I don't know anything and they probably won't tell me unless it really happens. And I think that is a very frustrating experience, that it feels like maybe it's inevitable, but is it inevitable? When you look at the tech landscape, I personally also feel a lot of frustration with, I think in a way you could see this coming. And there has been all this talk about hypergrowth for the past 2 years. And I've always been very like critical of this. And now I feel like, yeah, great. So now you kind of played with people's livelihoods and a lot of people are maybe, yeah, I don't know, letting more people go than needs to. There's other ways you could cut. I don't know, like, I don't want to judge anyone and stuff, but part of me just feels frustrated with the world, I guess, as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, it is a worry when, you know, when I definitely have been through that before, where you've been in a company that's in hypergrowth and they've scaled up the team hugely, and you're just waiting for that point where they're like, oh, actually, we need to streamline this a bit more. And it's always like, I don't know, it's always sort of when you join a company that's in that phase, it is always something that you do sort of worry about, that security, that long-term security. I was wondering about how, like, I've definitely had it with my team where, you know, they're worried about layoffs because they've seen what's happening in the sort of wider tech field. And, you know, it doesn't kind of matter what the CEO says. You know, if CEO comes out and says, we're not looking to reduce headcount, and then the next week there's a couple of like sneaky layoffs in one of the other teams. And it does give people the jitters. And, you know, I wondered what support you get from your own managers in, I guess, like managing team expectations. And I think, you know, sometimes they don't know because, you know, there are things that they might, you know, conversations or strategic things that they might not be party to. But do they sort of, you know, support you in reassuring the teams? How does that work in your organizations?
I can speak to that because I had some thoughts when we were going over the last question, which is actually we've been lucky because in our restructure we did add design, research, and writing leadership into our extended leadership team. So I recognize that I'm in a privileged position to know if these things are coming. But what I recognized as we were speaking was it is that fear that you feel from your team that you might not expect they're having. And that's what's come as a surprise to me, where I start to notice that some of my direct reports are getting nervous, or I see the conversations happening and I realize that I have to do more to communicate. I have to do more to communicate what I know, what I can share, and reassure people that if something's going to happen, I will be the person who lets them know ahead of time. I'm not going to let any surprises happen. So I think that's my thought about the other question. But on our side, in that I keep talking about this restructure, but it was like the biggest thing we've done. It's been the best thing for my craft in a decade. The person who stepped up to lead user experience is a former research director. So I have a really great manager in the fact that she understands small crafts. And so she is like an ally. And so she's very much like, we're going to set the objectives, we've got the strategic vision, and then you just get on with it. But I can also have those conversations with her where I'm like, I need you to have my back when I'm not in the room. there will be moments when I'm not there. I need you to understand my vision. I need you to know what I care about so that you like speak for me when I can't speak for myself. And I think, yeah, that's been what's been really great about our current situation. And I think actually it's made me want to be better at that as well. Like, how do I do that for my own people? When you have a good manager, you want to sort of mirror that back. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really nice, like knowing you've got that support from your peers. If you're in a situation where you have got kind of peers that, you know, they understand what your team might be feeling because their team's probably feeling the same, and you know, you can have those conversations. Heldiney and Nicole, do you have sort of peers at your level that you can, you know, bounce these kind of things off or discuss with them and see if their teams, you know, going through similar things with their teams?
I mean, I do, but I feel, and this again could be a very personal thing, I often try to stop myself from starting those conversations because I feel like we usually just spiral towards more and more anxiety and maybe reading into things that we shouldn't be reading into. I don't know if you know, there's an app called Blind, where you can kind of anonymously sign up with your company email, and then you can anonymously discuss with your colleagues. And when I had that panic, that initial panic that I was going to get laid off, I signed up for that. Do not do that, because every single thing that leadership posts now, people take apart, and every single headline is slower, one step closer to layoffs. And this is why you won't get a like, it's been very triggering. And I realized that I was having somewhat these kind of discussions with my peers as well, where we try to make each other feel better, but maybe we weren't, because you just like, you're maybe both in a state of fear or anxiety. And so I'm actively trying to avoid talking about this. Doesn't always work, but that's at least my take right now.
That's an interest. Yeah, it's interesting that, because, you know, you do need someone to understand what you're going through, but at the same time, you don't want to like get into that negative spiral. And yeah, it's really easy to do, isn't it? Heldiney, how do you sort of manage that?
I think about this a lot. Before, or when I became a volunteer Samaritan, I remember being so fascinated by it all. I tried to apply as much as possible that I learned in terms of the types of conversations and how to have those conversations at work, to see how much of those skills could I use to like help create safe spaces and help create honest dialogues and so on and so forth. And what I learned, I would say fairly quickly, is that there's a ceiling as to how safe a space you can create at work. And that ceiling is bound by, ultimately, is a commercial entity. And the fact that it is a commercial entity means that there are points where it may actually have to make decisions that involve things that are not in your best interest, but are in the broader best interest of the company. And as someone that has been in the mental health sector for a while now, I think it's something that at Monzo I've seen it done fairly well, but I'm not sure it can be truly achieved in a commercial setting. And I'm not sure if we're truly challenging ourselves as leaders and as businesses to actually get there. I feel that to some extent, and I think Monzo's no exception, leaders accept that actually, even if you do care about someone, there's a level of arm's length distance that people keep. You can build friendships, and I think I'm sure many of us have had a version of that in either current companies or previous companies. You can have close people that have become friends, and you sort of have this layer of interaction that sort of goes beyond the fact that you work together, but also has that included. But if you say try to have a level of candor that you can fully express your anxiety with your boss or someone in leadership, then people become, justifyingly so, worried about how they might be perceived in terms of a performance review, how they may be perceived in terms of the culture they're creating in the organization, and all of these other things. But actually, if you look at the stats in terms of what people are saying in like anonymous feedback, everyone is feeling this. So it then becomes a very strange thing, because everyone's feeling it, but you're not allowed to talk about it because everyone's afraid of how they're going to be perceived. So it's a very odd like scenario that I think we all find ourselves in. I can't yet think of anything that's come close to a solution. But one of the things that we want to start exploring, or I'm proposing that we start exploring a bit more at Monzo, is a situation in which people and or managers have a better understanding of the different modes that individuals might be in, and are better prepared to support people in those different modes. And those modes happen even outside of macro trends like this. So if, let's say, someone who's very, very close to you has passed away, even if you're generally a high performer, you're going to be in a different mode. You might be in a mode of trying to take good care of yourself and trying to make sense of this chaos that has recently been introduced in your life. That doesn't mean you're not a high performer. It just means that you're not in a high performance mode right now. And that's cool. That doesn't mean that your performance review is going to suck. But equally, if you're in a super high performance mode, and maybe you've been doing so for like the past 6 months, and maybe people start noticing that you're consistently on at like 7, 8 p.m., that actually maybe you might have been in that mode for too long too. And someone needs to flag and have conversation with you. Actually, maybe you should take it a bit easy, so on and so forth. That's sort of one of the latest ideas that I've had, and I'm trying to work with design leadership at Monzo to see how we can get more into a space where we start to recognize those modes and we start to normalize those modes. But I've not yet seen an implementation that's, foolproof.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, we're sort of told to, show vulnerability, bring our whole selves to work and, be authentic. But actually, at the same time, like there is that fear of being judged for your performance. And, I'm seeing it a lot in my teams at the moment where they've got, some awful stuff going on and they're just expected to like compartmentalize so much that they can just kind of get on with it. And I appreciate that we're all working in commercial businesses where there's goals to hit and targets to meet, but at the same time, people are human, we're not robots. And there has to be a level of acknowledgement that sometimes these things are going to affect your performance. Yeah, it's so tricky. So I sort of feel like sometimes in leadership, we don't have that, like, I don't know, I would call it sort of, peers at the same level that you can vent to, or that you can have those conversations, or you're worried about it because, like you say, sometimes you can kind of bring each other down, and it can feel like actually you just then, panic yourselves even more. I'm interested to know if any of you have like kind of someone like a coach or a mentor or someone independent that you can turn to and have those conversations. Maybe if you don't have someone at work that you can do that with. Anyone? Kelly, if you've got anyone that you can just phone up and
I think I've been with the company for 12 years. So I have managed to build up, I would say, a nice circle of trust of people in other departments who work far enough away from my team that I feel like I can vent, but they know the company well enough to give me solid advice and steer me right and tell me if they see the same challenges on their side. I think that's really important. I do have a coach as well. I have a coach through a women in leadership program that I'm in at the moment. And that for me has been really useful because I'm like a super introvert. And so my coach is really working with me to understand like how to be a quiet leader, but how to be effective. And like every strength that you has a downside. And then how do you work around that? And like, how do you not tackle the hardest things for you, but tackle the ones that are like close enough within your reach that you can really maximize it. So for me, that's been really useful, I think, this year, especially with the challenges going on and restructuring and all of that kind of stuff that we've all felt.
Yeah, that sounds like it's super useful. I recommend as well, Sarah Butcher does a coaching course, a leadership coaching course, which I did this year, and I found that super helpful. Just, it's quite good to have that self-reflection as well about these different sort of situations do play a role in ultimately how you lead. Sometimes it's just good to kind of reflect on that. Nicole, do you, like, I know you said you're on maternity leave, but do you have sort of a network of or do you have a coach or anything like that?
I used to have a coach. I don't work with her anymore just because I felt like I got what I needed. I did originally reach out to her primarily actually because I used to, I mean, it's still a bit of an issue, but I've gotten better. I like connect very heavily with my work, like identify very heavily with it. And with that, you just get affected more. I mean, while going through this period with layoffs, of course, that's a big obvious thing. But even before that, you know, you maybe reach much into feedback, or you feel like someone else on your level is getting promoted faster, things like that would affect me very heavily. And I wasn't sure who to talk to about that because I felt like it wasn't always the right thing to just address it with my manager right away. And sometimes you don't want to get colleagues involved. So that's when I actually started working with the coach to really help me kind of disconnect who I am a little bit more from what I do at work, which was super helpful. And we're friends now, so we do chat every now and then, just not like in an official coaching setting. But it's definitely something I can recommend doing if you have the resources and the time and the energy to work on yourself. Because for me, that was kind of a big takeaway. Like, I had to really sit down and think about what did I want to work on? How did I want to put the work into it? And yeah, it was pretty emotionally challenging as well. So I think a lot of mentoring and coaching which is like super side note. I think this is not something you mentioned, but I think specifically in heavier economical times, I see so much just talk about like people saying, oh, just get a mentor or just get like a coach to work with. But there's a lot of weight in that relationship between a coach and a coachee and a mentor and a mentee. And it's great that so many people volunteer, but I also kind of worry about how safe it is if everyone just starts mentoring. I mean, I'm not saying that there's some, well, I mean, I'm kind of saying not everyone is like the best person to mentor someone. And sometimes I'm a little bit concerned of like, why no one is really cross-checking any of this. And I'm just a little bit worried because I personally have also experienced people and worked with people who thought they were really great at coaching and mentoring when that was not the case. And I just feel like in times like this where people may be more anxious or scared, yeah, I worry a little bit about just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I do see that, because you have expectations as well when you kind of start developing a relationship with a coach or mentor. Like, you have an expectation of what you might get from that, and some, it can go really badly wrong. I mean, it can end up being like a bad relationship. Like, I had a mentor for a few sessions, and then all of a sudden she just said that she didn't even say she didn't have time. She just said, I think we're done here. And I felt like I've been dumped, it felt like, and it was like really had an effect on me, because I was like, well, what have I done wrong? I thought I was kind of building up this, working relationship with someone. And it's just, you need that level of trust as well, I think, and need to know what you're both kind of going to get from that relationship. Otherwise it can be it can actually have the opposite effect to what it should do, which is offering that level of kind of support and guidance. It can almost have the opposite effect. And Heldiney, do you have like a network of leaders that you can turn to, or people that mentor you?
Yeah, I've had an interesting experience in this space. Well, before I get into it, firstly, it sucks that that person left it like that with you, Rachel. For what it's worth, it's certainly not a reflection of how amazing you are, because you are. On the mentoring front, when I was younger, I was sort of very sort of active with trying to find a mentor, specifically because in hindsight, I understand it very clearly now. I think I understood it then, but I've always felt a little lonely to be the only Black person in every design team I've ever been part of. And it's not that it's always been something that has hindered me in any way, but I've always felt there are these like small nuances of like the experience. I didn't feel I had anyone to talk to. I remember I reached out to like Black CEOs on LinkedIn to see if anyone would be interested in being my mentor, and I do not recommend it. It's the most awkward thing, because if you imagine just a random person messaging, say, "Hey, do you want to be my mentor?" It usually doesn't work. And I remember at the time feeling a bit sad about it, because I thought, oh well, I would think that if I became a super successful Black person, I would want to help another Black person who's also interested in being supported, and that remains true today. And I mentor a lot of people, but I don't know. In hindsight, maybe I get it. But what's worked really well for me is there's this term that I've only heard this year, and I've only started doing it this year, called mutual mentoring. And Monzo set up a formal program specifically for people of color, initially anyway, to be paired with, if you're level 4 is senior at Monzo, or below, you're matched with someone who's level 6, director and above. Level 6 or above. And the relationship is you're matched with someone that's white, and the point is that you deliberately use it as an opportunity to talk about your various lived experiences. And it's mutual mentoring because no one's there to teach the other how to do anything. You're there to learn from each other. So I was very fortunate to be paired with, and this wasn't deliberate, I think it was completely random, but I got very lucky to be paired with Jonas, the co-founder of Monzo, who's also the CTO of Monzo. And he is like just as nerdy as I am, and if not more. And he has a level of passion for tech, and he is sort of like Monzo embodied. He was one of the first people there, so he's a very empathetic person, asks really great questions, and is generally someone who's super curious. So that relationship has actually meant a great deal to me in terms of my overall sense of like psychological safety at work, because one of my like mentors and mentees at the same time is a fairly senior person in the business. We had really great conversations about the differences and nuances between working in tech and as a white man, and working in tech as a Black man. It was well timed, because by the time, say, the Elon Musk's thing started happening, our relationship was in a good place that we were able to speak about that really objectively. So one of the things that I spoke to him about was, when you're being Black in society generally means that you feel compelled to overplay how safe you are to people around you, so that people don't feel threatened, so that people don't feel scared, and that manifests itself into the risks that you take, into the way you speak to people, so on and so forth. And we had a really good conversation about how if I became a leader of a tech company, I would feel like I could never do what Elon Musk does, because the perception coming from a Black man, or a prevalent Black man would be, I feel, would be different, and society would not quite interpret it in the same way if I was like aggressively like letting go of people and saying the things that he does on Twitter. And it was really great to start to have a sense of, like, one of the more senior people in the company has empathy for some of the nuances of my lived experience. And that's, I think, the closest thing I've ever had to a mentor in my career. But before that, it's usually been peer relationships. And I think I've had mutual mentoring before. I didn't know it was mutual mentoring, but I think probably many of us can relate to having friends that we feel are very wise. And if you have a healthy relationship with each other, where you're not, constantly using each other for only emotional support, it feels like a really wonderful exchange of learning from each other and being supportive of each other.
Yeah. And I sort of, I feel that, because like I never, like, apart from that one experience I had, I've never had a mentor. But what I've always quite liked about the content community particular, and design community just in general, is that if you have got friends who also work in tech, when you kind of chat to them about their teams and what they're going through, it's so validating, because half the time you kind of come away from work thinking, oh God, I'm a terrible manager, no one's happy with anything, like, everything's falling to pieces, nothing's working the way it should be, none of the processes that we should be following are in place. And you talk to someone else and you're like, oh God, it's not just me, like everyone feels like that. And so I think like sometimes we sort of, you know, almost like put so much pressure on ourselves that everything needs to be kind of running perfectly and, you know, doing everything in this textbook way. And, you know, it's often just so nice in a way to hear that other people are also having the similar problems or having the similar challenges, and that you're not as alone as you think you are. And I think sometimes I certainly feel it, that I don't have any peers at my level in my organization. And, you know, you can't always share your worries or concerns or challenges with the people in your team, because, you know, you've got to be the strong leader and everything's fine. You can't project that negativity onto them. And so like, how do you what tips have you got for kind of overcoming that feeling when you do feel isolated in your workplace, on a day-to-day basis? Have any of you got tips on how you've kind of coped with that?
I know I was the last one to speak, but the one thing I would say that has made a huge difference in my life is, and I'm starting to apply this in my leadership position as well, is where possible, just being upfront with the information about how I'm feeling and what's on my mind. And I find that when I first started doing it, it was very uncomfortable. And I remember the first time I did it was when my grandma passed away in November, and I sent a message to the whole branch at Samaritans letting people know that I was grieving, and thus I didn't book shifts for a while. And it was odd to tell like a whole 100 people what's on my mind. And at first I thought, okay, this is strange. I shouldn't have done that. I was overthinking it, and I felt really stupid. And then I was seeing that gradually, the more people I interacted with in the branch, the more they would share things with me, and the more they would like praise that specific message that I sent. So I think that was a good experiment in that context, because it meant that I then started to say it in other contexts. I started to share. If people ask me at work, I would say, oh, you know what, I'm actually quite worried. I don't feel like, this part of the year I've performed really well. I'm actually a bit worried. I feel like we could have done more in this area, that area. Anyway, how are you doing? And it can catch people off guard a little bit, that you're just being open about something that in theory you shouldn't be sharing with each other. So I found that that's made a larger difference than I was expecting. And sometimes it still feels uncomfortable, like to tell someone I'm worried about my performance. But usually it pays off.
And Kelly, with a big team that you've got, such a big team, how, I think it is really important sometimes to be vulnerable like that and be able to admit that. But do you feel like you can do that with such a large team, or is there a level of, I don't know, does it feel different with a team that size of kind of, opening yourself up in that way?
I would say definitely. I know we'll talk about this later, but I had a quite bad burnout a few years back. And so a lot of my team saw me go through that. So I think they saw me come back and be really vulnerable, which already made those conversations quite easy, actually. I don't feel like you should hold those things back personally. So I do think that there's a level of, of distance you have to take, but there's also like that level of humanness where you're like, you know what, I've been there and I don't want you to go there. And if I'm giving you this advice, or if I'm here to listen to you, it's because I know how bad it can be and it's not worth it, so let's just talk about it.
Did that contribute to that burnout, that feeling of like, I've got to be the one that's in control here. I can't, let anyone know that maybe things aren't going the way that I would want them to, or like, how did that kind of manifest in that?
I think it's the opposite. I think hopefully what you can hear from me is a lot of positivity. I'm a very optimistic person in general. And so I think like what it came back was, I came back going, oh, I know everything that we've done wrong. How can I be a part of making it right? Right. So like, how can I actually set psychological safety up for my teams? How can I protect them? How can we, just move forward and show everyone just how great we all are. It sounds really kind of trite, but it's really how I feel about it. I think sometimes you have to go that low to come back and go, all right, we got this, let's do it.
Just step away and have time to reflect on, like, yeah. I've totally had that in jobs where I've come away from it and then I've gone on to the next job and I've suddenly, on reflection, figured out everything that I should have done and why it didn't work.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that moment of realization where you're like, actually, I'm going to do things differently this time.
Yeah, it's that, like, you sit at home totally burnt out and feeling horrible and you're like, this is what I would do. And then actually going back and being like, you know what, I'm going to do everything that I think we should have done and try to empower my people.
I was wondering about your maternity leave, Nicole, as well, whether that's given you a period of like reflection on how things were going, how you might do things differently when you go back.
I mean, there hasn't been a lot of time to reflect, but in a way, that's a reflection of its own. I think for me, it's just, I don't know, like I mentioned in an earlier question, I've always felt really, really connected to my work, and like work has always taken up a huge place in my life. My husband and I, we've been together for almost a decade now, but the only thing we ever fight about is work and me working too much or taking on too much. And I think what changed since having this baby is that I just feel like, you know what, I mean, maybe I actually don't care that much anymore. So that has been a really nice change. It hasn't been a reflection, it just kind of happened. Which I guess is nice. Like, I'm still probably more passionate about it than many other people in the field, but I'm also okay with letting it go and letting some projects go. And, I also freelance besides working at Spotify, and I've always been very like terrified of like dropping a client, even if the relationship wasn't good for me and I actually didn't enjoy working with that client. And now I'm actually really fine with saying, you know what, like, I don't like this. And that's been, it sounds super basic, but it's been huge for me. I mean, apparently it takes pushing out a human for some people to realize that. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that for me has been a big thing. Yeah.
But obviously, like, your priorities do shift a bit when you've got kids, because you realize that, you have a responsibility where, perhaps before you were able to throw yourself like into work and into like lots of side projects and freelancing, and then like now you just like physically don't have that time, but then also you still need time to kind of decompress and switch off, because otherwise, like, having been there with, being a parent with 2 kids and a full-time job, like, it's you've got to sort of almost like force yourself to find that work-life balance, because otherwise it can become all consuming. So I guess you're still finding your feet in that right now with kind of being a new parent, but is that something that you've struggled with to kind of get that balance right so far?
I mean, I would say definitely. I think it's maybe less about the balance for me and more about the fact that I just take work so damn seriously. Like, in the end, most of us aren't directly saving lives on a daily basis. And maybe it's not as important as, especially a lot of these tech companies make it seem, with all their like deadlines and pressure and all of that. And like, funnily enough, I was just joking about this with my husband. Like, this baby, I feel like, of course, I want to engage with her and I want to make sure she reaches all her milestones. But at the same time, they're a little bit like parasites. Like, they will develop very likely even without a lot of help from you. And I feel like it is a little bit like that, or like, it's good to look at work a little bit more like that as well. Like, if you're in the room, that already is a huge achievement. And just with you being there and being involved in projects, you're already doing a lot. So maybe it's okay to not take them all super seriously and always feel like you need to give 200% and potentially get disappointed. So I think it's maybe less about the balance, because I'm good at giving myself some balance in certain ways, but it's more about like, it's maybe not even like something I need to worry about that much. I'm sorry, I'm getting a delivery. I have to answer really quick.
That's all right. Heldiney, you've got 2 jobs. I'm keen to know how you find that balance, because like when you talk about your jobs, I'm like, oh my God, you must just be working like 24/7. How is that? How do you switch off and find that?
I mean, here you are running a panel, Rachel, and
I know.
yeah, I think I when a while ago I would fairly say easily describe myself as a workaholic in some way, but not in a sort of like, because the whole concept of it is there becomes a problem to you and to others. It never became a problem to me or to others, fortunately, but it was imbalanced relative to, you know, how much I think more above all else, how much headspace I would give to it. Like, even if I'm not at work, I'll be thinking about like things related to work. I would go on holidays and it would take me 3 days before I'm not thinking about work, and my partner would feel it. But what has helped me is, if anything, having a more diversified way of receiving or acquiring a sense of fulfillment that's not entirely grounded in my full-time paid work means that work just has less weight in my life. So it means that when work finishes, even if I wanted to work more, I can't, because I've got some Samaritans things to do. And equally, when I want to do more Samaritans things, it's like, nope, I can't. I've got to earn a salary. So it does help to have more things that are closer to my heart. So when I do Samaritans related work, I don't feel like I'm working. Firstly, I don't get rewarded for it monetarily anyway. And secondly, there are no performance reviews. There's no sort of enticement of a promotion or anything specifically that I'm working towards, other than the overall outcome that the charity is trying to achieve, which is fewer deaths by suicide and more people feeling emotionally supported. And it's really interesting, like, work as well. Like, in that process, for me, it's, I think, equivalent to like reading a book that you really enjoy, because I'm just learning so much about the mental health sector, and I get to meet really cool people like the MP for Walthamstow, and understand what work they're doing on trying to better equip local services with a better mental health capabilities. So, you know, learning things like the police have to deal with, the majority of the cases the police deal with are mental health related, and the majority of the cases that lots of GPs have to deal with are mental health related. They're people struggling with a variety of things that they don't know who to go to, so they go to these professionals that are easily accessible, so on and so forth. So these are things that like really give me energy, and it means that I don't now think of myself as Heldiney, the product designer at Monzo, and thus I need to continue progressing at pace in my career as a product designer. I know, Nicole, earlier you shared around, you know, if someone else gets promoted, you start to look at yourself. I used to feel the same, but now I'm like, really good for them. That is so great. I'm so happy they got promoted, but that's not something I'm working on right now. I'm working on this other thing, and I'm glad that I don't have to take on like a promotion, because I need more time to be a director, actually, for example.
I think that's really a really important thing for us all to remember as well, because, you know, it's so tempting to like just have that sort of comparison mentality. Like, you know, for a long time I was seeing people going into like leadership roles, and I was like, why don't I get a job like that? And I was just comparing myself, and then, you know, you kind of have to like realize that everybody's sort of journey is different, and, you know, what's right for one person at one time isn't going to be right for another. But, you know, that is really hard. It is often really hard, particularly in our industry, where there is this kind of, you know, sort of mentality, this sort of, you know, I don't know, it feels like everyone's just striving to do more and be better, and you know, it's not necessarily a healthy way for us to live. Helly, having kind of been through the burnout and you know, been through that yourself, do you sort of have to like consciously put things in place to help you kind of keep that balance?
Yeah, oh, 100%. I mean, it's been a few years now, but I basically track myself. I did a lot of work on like my triggers, right? Like if I leave a meeting and I've been triggered, I'm trying to understand why that was, so I can sort that out for myself. think also like recognizing when my stress starts to rise. And I think what's been really helpful for me is that I do try to like bake it into the values of like my management philosophy and how we work. Because I don't think that there's any shame in taking time for yourself. I think you should be able to close your computer and go for a walk. I think you should be able to say, you know what, let's make this meeting async. I even will be, it's a sunny day, guys. I don't know how many more of these we have. Just leave, go take it off. It's like, you have to actually live those values, because like by talking that way with your team, by praising people for work-life balance, you have to sort of do it yourself. So as somebody who's been through that, it's like, it's almost like reverse psychology on myself. Like if I say this thing is true, then I have to also shut my computer and go. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I feel that modeling behavior is something that is really easily forgotten, and I do it myself. Like I send Slack messages out of hours because I'm working and I forget that other people are working, or I don't want them to respond like now. I'm just doing it while I remember, but actually it is contributing to what they feel might be like an expectation of how they work, and you sort of have to check yourself and remember that, don't you? And yeah, it can be really tough when you're a manager to just remember that you are a role model for people, or you should be a role model for people. I want to make sure we've got enough time for people to ask questions, so I've got one more like just sort of topic that I'd like to hear from you all on as well. How do you, when things do get stressful, and you sort of mentioned that you like track yourself and monitor yourself, but how do you manage that stress? Like, have you got a sort of good strategy in place for recognizing that and managing it? Kelly, as you were just talking, I'll ask you that one first.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, because I've been through it, I feel like there are certain times of year that we all know are stressful. Like I know this time of year is always horrible because of planning and performance reviews and all of that. And, you know, every year it's like, we're always surprised, you know? So I am like I like will go and block off my calendar. If I know something is coming, I will already work in that like work-life balance and make sure that nothing will get in the way. Like, I don't want to be surprised. And then I go for walks. Like I like to stretch. Like, this is so silly, but if I feel like something has just been too much, I seriously just shut my computer and just, because if you don't get ahead of it early enough, it'll come back and haunt you. So it's just listening to those signs and taking immediate action, I think, is how I approach it.
Nicole, how about you? What do you do? You take the dog for a walk?
No, that's just more stressful. She's very grumpy and was pulled in certain directions. No, that does sometimes help. But I very similar to Kelly, I also block time from my calendar, both time to, go to the gym, but also time to actually get some flow work done, because I think specifically, like you mentioned, when there's planning going on, there's usually a lot more meetings. And then when you do performance reviews, at Spotify, for example, we also have to write pretty detailed performance reviews for our peers. Just adds up, like it's a lot of work on top of your usually already pretty dense workload towards the end of the year. So I just really try to make sure that I actually have time to work and don't get stressed about meetings. And I will, and I've gotten better at this, say no to let's hop on a quick call. I mean, to be fair, I'm the type of person I always hate it. And I hate it even more when I'm stressed, just because I have a short fuse. And then something that I have done with several teams that I've been on actually is just to make sure when times get stressful, do we have good async processes in place to really make it easy for us to check in, for us to not feel disconnected, and for us to also not feel the need to maybe have so many meetings. And then if you're working in a bigger team, which I've also worked in at Spotify previously, just acknowledge that there's different needs. There are people that feel like they want to check in person all the time because maybe they will get anxious if they read a Slack message that you maybe wrote when you were rushed, and they suddenly start interpreting things in that. And then there's people like me who just want to avoid meetings at all costs because that's what stresses me out. And sometimes it can just be very useful to talk about that. And even if you've talked about it previously, just remind each other that, hey, just so you know, I'm stressed right now. Just remember, this is how I work best. yeah, I don't know if that helps a little bit answering that question.
Yeah, I think it's really good to remember that as well, that not everything has to be a meeting, because I am really I'm terrible at calendar management. You know, I think the other day I had like 15 meetings in a day, which is just insane. Like there wasn't even time to eat. And I'm terrible at, because I think, oh, if all I'm doing is shifting it. If I move a meeting out to the next, all I'm doing is shifting the problem back. But I think it is actually, you know, very good to remember that, you know, maybe not everything needs to be a meeting. Is there anything that could be resolved in a different way? It's just the fallback when you're remote working, because, you know, it's the only way you get guaranteed time with somebody or a guaranteed response. But I think that's one of the risks of the remote work, is that everything becomes a meeting, whereas, you know, it wouldn't have been if you'd been in the office. It would have been like a, you know, coffee machine chat, or, you know, whatever, or walk to the sandwich shop, you know. And now everything has to be a meeting, and they're all inevitably half an hour, and inevitably everyone fills that whole half hour. So yeah, it's a good discipline to actually, you know, proactively avoid meetings if you can. Heldiney, what are your tips? How do you kind of cope when you're feeling the stress?
I've learned that my distress has come in two shapes: a short-term and a long-term version. The short-term version is usually linked to me building up bad habits, i.e., not sleeping a number of hours, i.e., having infrequent sleeping schedules, sleeping at different times on different days and waking up at different times, or skipping meals, whatever, you know, some of the examples that you shared, Rachel. And usually I find that in the short term, it means, oh, I feel a bit tired this afternoon. That's a bit odd. And then I'll look back at my schedule, like, oh, okay, cool, that makes sense. And one thing that I do that I'm a huge proponent for, and I say it all the time at Monzo, is afternoon naps. I love an afternoon nap, and I can sleep for 15 minutes if I need to. So I think in the day-to-day, that's something that really helps me. And I think I'm getting better at also leaning into what you described, Kelly. Just sometimes instead of working from 9 to 6, which is the usual sort of working hours at Monzo, just taking a 2-hour break in between. And maybe if you do feel like you want to make up for it at the end of the day, then make up for it. But if you don't, just do it in some other way throughout the week, or whatever you need to do. And shifting more to an outcomes mindset. If you can drive the outcomes that you need to drive, then don't worry too much about the hours and so on and so forth. The other one is like the long-term one, which I find is more common with me, which is feeling like I'm not working on something that fulfills me. I've been depressed at least once before, and I really like Jim Carrey's way of framing depression. He frames it, I'm not sure it's his thing, but he's the one that I still say it. He frames it as your mind needing deep rest from a character that you're playing that no longer wants to play. And like that term is, I just find so beautiful, because you get to these phases where you've been doing something that up until that point made you feel fulfilled, but for whatever reason, it no longer makes you feel fulfilled. And I think those are the ones that I usually find it requires a lot of like journaling, a lot of reflection, a lot of talking to other people and being super transparent, changing habits. If you usually go to the gym and you do a certain workout, maybe try a different workout, like maybe go swimming instead, whatever it is. And that requires a bit more revolution.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in the exercise side of things, and although I'm really terrible at taking those kind of breaks during the day, because unless like the mid-afternoon is where I like drop off a bit, and sometimes I'll just go, you know, I'll pick the kids up from school, I'll do a few chores, and then I'll log back on in the evening because my mind is fresher then. But I religiously do half an hour of exercise every morning before work. That's just my time. Even like, I know it sets me up for the day, because then I like know I've done some yoga or I've gone for a run and I've had like my time, and then I don't mind so much doing like my work time, because I've had that kind of time to like clear my mind before I start the day. And if I don't get that, it just makes me feel even like more like agitated before I even start work. One of the other things I've learned to do over the years is just like compartmentalize a lot more, like work, because, you know, I've had jobs before where, you know, I've taken it home with me every night. I felt really stressed. I felt like really kind of agitated by everything going on. And I think, like, you know, one of you said earlier, you know, we're not in an environment where we're saying, you know, like doing, you know, surgery every day, or, you know, it's just tech. And I've kind of just learned to be able to like let it go if things are going like badly at work. Just walk away, close the door. I think it really helps having an office where I can shut the door and walk back to my house and be like, I've locked it away now. Until tomorrow, it's locked away. And yeah, I think that really helps. Whereas, you know, I think it's really hard remote working when you are working at home to sometimes switch off, but you kind of got to force yourself sometimes to just like lock your laptop in a room or whatever it takes, just like put it in the, I don't know, lock it in the loft, whatever it takes, just to like shut that away for a few hours, or, you know, a weekend. And I do really love that explanation of the Jim Carrey quote really resonated, because I felt like that for a long time when I was actually married. I didn't realize, like, for a long time why I felt like depressed, and then I realized that I was, you know, living a life I didn't want to be leading. And as soon as I recognized that and made that change, and yeah, my like life changed and my outlook on everything changed, and I hadn't even realized it at the time. But for that kind of playing a character you don't want to be playing, like, yeah, it just really feels like once you recognize that, you can do something about it and you can make that change. But you don't always recognize it when you're there in that moment. So yeah, it's really good. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so I just want to ask if anybody's got any questions for our panelists. Feel free to either put it in the chat or come off mute or put your hand up. But yeah, I'd love to sort of open the floor if anyone's got any questions for anybody.
I have a question about how do you find that balance of working, of course, leading a team, and find that time to keep learning and developing your own career. I personally struggle. I'm the one saying save 2 hours per week, learn, read something, but I don't do it myself. So yeah, just understanding, if sharing your thoughts.
Anybody got, you know, does anyone specifically block out time for that and then actually stick to it?
Yes.
Or are we all terrible at doing that?
I am terrible, but like I mentioned, I'm in a training program right now, and I did make I made an effort this time. I saw some of my managers do a great training, and I saw how much they grew. I was like wanting to cry at the end. I was like, oh my God, why aren't I doing that for myself? So I feel like I'm making myself take it seriously, if that makes sense. I don't know, because I think sometimes we do passive learning, sometimes there are opportunities that are presented that you could let pass by, or just sort of go along for the ride. And you can also make that conscious decision to be like, I'm really going to give this my all. That would be my answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can just add to that. Something that has worked well for me in the past is to try to look at it a little bit as like a seasonal effort. So either on a yearly basis, maybe I want to sit down now and reflect on this year and decide, you know what, next year I'm going to maybe make a more conscious effort to learn a specific task or skill, or maybe just how to be a better leader. And then that's maybe something I'll focus on for that year, or maybe half of that year. And then the next year I'll do something else. So for me, it has helped to try to let go of that pressure of having to do it all the time, kind of besides all the other things I have to do, and instead kind of work a little bit more with milestones. It's actually something I learned from my coach, fun fact, to kind of connect the dots there. So that has been really helpful. So for example, this year I have made 0 effort, and it's been really, really freeing. And I felt very guilty about it in the beginning. And I was thinking, oh, I'm falling behind, and all these people on Twitter are talking about stuff that I don't know anything about. And now I feel really good about it. And maybe next year I'll dig in, or not, and see what happens.
I try to encourage my team to set themselves a quarterly learning target, whether it's to do a course or go to a conference or read a book, but something small, because I think sometimes those small things do add up over time, but you kind of need to do it in small chunks of time, like a quarter, because if you go, oh, I'm going to do this thing this year, inevitably it's, you know, it's like a New Year's resolution, inevitably it just passes by the wayside. But it's hard, it's hard to find the time. I mean, we have learning days at work. Every couple of months they say, right, we're just going to block out a whole day for people to learn. They can do whatever they want in that time, but it has to be something that's helping them learn. And either, you know, they can do something, a work course, or they can go and read a book or watch some talks. But the blocking that time out, I think, is genuinely the only way it really happens, because, like, as you said, Stefania, it's one of those things that's on the backlog, but it's not high priority.
Yes. Always falls behind.
Yeah.
I also find that it can help, or it's helped me a great deal to lean into like getting signals from my own brain when it wants to learn, because sometimes you find that I'm someone who reads a lot, and I throughout, on an average year, I'll read, like, I don't know if you might think it's a lot, but I think it's a lot, like 50 books a year. And there was a point that I started to question whether I was getting much value from like reading all those books. And there were clear phases where actually just not reading and maybe doing something different, like taking action or something, or actually just getting better at doing the things I do all the time, but just having better time management, for example. Like, learning takes so many different shapes, and I think sometimes we can box learning into this thing that involves like intake of new information, whereas actually sometimes you're learning just by doing something that you've done all the time, but like slightly differently and slightly better, and that does not involve necessarily any intake of new information, like reading an article, like going somewhere you've never been before, but you're still learning. And your brain would tell you if it doesn't feel like it's not learning enough, and you would get signals and you would have an impetus to take action in some way.
Any more questions in the last minute before we wrap up?
I don't have a question, but can I just chime in as an old person? Because I went through the, back to the very start of this, about the anxiety about layoffs and the current state. I was in the whole .bomb boom in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's got kind of a similar feel, but the scale and the scope of it is nothing like that. Like, the layoffs we've seen so far is something like 1 or 2% of the tech workforce. Back then it was like 10 or 20 or something like that. So I think the scale is different. I think we're also in an era, the whole thing is just rolling along. Like, everybody needs a content marketing operation because of SEO, and we're all every business is now a publisher. And that same notion of software eating the world, that like any enterprise of any size is now a software development company as well. Did anybody go to Button? I don't see anybody else. At Button, there's this place in America called McMaster Carr. It's like this little industrial manufacturing supply place. They, screws and sheet metal and stuff like that. They sent 10 content designers to Button. Wow. So I think that's just one glimpse, I think, of like how entrenched these fields are. We might not get the cool, 7-figure salary at Facebook or, at Meta or Twitter, but there's going to be plenty of this. I mean, people should probably still be anxious about a looming global recession, but I think for us, I don't think it's as, anyhow, I'm not as worried as I was back then, I'll just say. So.
It's good. I think it is reassuring that, people are still hiring. There is a small number of layoffs happening with some of the bigger tech companies, but I think, to the point we had earlier, they were sort of hyper growth companies that maybe needed to sort of scale back a little bit. And there are plenty of people that are hiring. So I think it's probably going to be a different case in the new year. I guess there's a lot of book balancing happening at this time of year as well, and reassuring investors and things. So I'm feeling hopeful that it will be a better place come January, and there'll be a bit more positivity as well. But no, thank you, Larry. It's reassuring to hear that from you as well. We're kind of out of time, so I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, because it's been a really interesting, engaging and useful conversation. So thank you, Kelly, Heldiney and Nicole. It's been lovely to have you here. And also thank you to everybody who's come along and joined us for the chat. Hopefully it was useful to you all. And have a lovely holiday season. Hopefully you will get some rest as well.
Thank you.
so much. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks for having
Bye.
me.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, Kelly.